Malcolm here, and today we're going to be learning about North Africa, and we're going to be taking a closer look into that Trans-Saharan trade that we talked about during our first lesson for North Africa. So the title of today's lesson is Gold, Salt, Slaves, and Islam. Make sure you have your notes in front of you, and again, make sure you remove any and all distractions, and let's do this. All right, by the end of this lesson, you should be able to analyze the importance of gold, salt, and slaves as commodities of trade. And you should be able to explain how Islam spread throughout both North and West Africa. So make sure you write those down at the top of your notes. Those are our learning targets for this lesson. All right, so let's get into it. So last lesson, we were talking about Trans-Saharan trade, and I promised you that we would take a closer look into some of the resources that were traded. And those two main resources are gold and salt. And we call these commodities. Commodities is just a fancy word for trade goods. Okay, anything that is valuable that one country or civilization can trade with another or amongst themselves would be considered a commodity. Now, Africa's two most important commodities were gold and salt. Now, you might be saying to yourself, salt? What the heck? We're going to talk about that in a minute. So starting in AD 400s, started this gold salt trade, and it's lasted for hundreds of years, and in fact, it's still going on today. All right, so during medieval history in this part of the world, salt was worth as much as gold. So essentially, you could trade a pound of salt for a pound of gold equally. And why was that? Well, salt was really important. First of all, salt is used to preserve and flavor food. And what that means is, before the time of the invention of the refrigerator, food spoils very quickly, especially in, 130-degree temperatures that they experience in the Sahara Desert. And so by adding salt to food such as meat, it dries them out and keeps it good for later. And of course, to flavor food, we have the opposite problem. A lot of our foods today are highly processed and they include a ton of salt in them. So we actually have the opposite problem today. We need salt to survive. Okay, you cannot live if you do not have sodium in your diet. And unfortunately, in this part of the world, North and West Africa, they ate a very plant-based diet, and plants don't have salt in them. They don't have the salt that the human body needs to break down to survive. And so we also lose salt during sweating. Okay, so if you've ever, ran the mile, or, you're in soccer practice, you may have noticed, if you've ever accidentally tasted your salt, if you've really been working hard, that salt tastes sweaty. And that's because salt is a waste product that our body gets rid of. And if you're sweating a lot, if you're perspiring a lot, as you would in 130-degree temperatures, your body is going to need to replace that salt. Okay. Now the problem is salt was very rare or scarce in West Africa. So hence we end up with what's called the gold salt trade. A little side note, did you know? I'm just going to go ahead and read this to you. The Roman army required salt for its soldiers, horses, and livestock. At times, soldiers were even paid in salt. In Latin, their money was called salarium, and that's how we get the word salary. Salary is when you get paid for working. The idioms "worth his salt" or "earning one's salt" can be traced to the same origin. By the way, this was just, a little extra information. You don't have to write this slide in your notes. All right, so gold salt trade. In the Western Sudan, which you see I have highlighted on the left here, this is just the term for, south of the Sahara, south of the desert here. They had gold mines, but they lacked salt. Okay, in the Sahara Desert, they had tons of salt deposits. Remember, it used to be an ocean. Eventually, that ocean dried up and it left behind salt. And so they had tons of salt, but no gold. And so what we end up with is a transaction, a trade. So salt merchants, as we see in this map here, salt merchants would actually cross the vast Sahara Desert to trade with the West Africans down here. Now, West Africans got the salt they needed to survive. But then salt merchants, when they return back, with the gold, they would then take the gold and they would sell it to Europe, and Europe would use it to make jewelry and coins because gold was rare in Europe. And they would also exchange the gold for different products from India, like spices, for instance. And in China, they would receive the very valuable silk cloth. And we call this trade Trans-Saharan or Trans-Saharan trade. Trans simply means across, and Sahara means desert. So Trans-Saharan trade is trade across the desert. The gold and salt were not the only things that were traded across the Sahara Desert during the Middle Ages. Unfortunately, Africans were also enslaved to work and forced to work in these gold and salt mines. And this was incredibly grueling work. So, starting in about the 600s, people who had been enslaved were traded across the Sahara as goods. And this is called the Trans-Saharan slave trade. Now, the conditions that these people were subjected to were horrendous, horrible conditions. And many of those who were enslaved came from the Niger Delta region. And if we take a look here on our map, Niger region, Delta region would be right here in West Africa along the coast here. They were captured, they were stolen from their families, they were chained together and forced to march across the desert to work in those salt mines in the Sahara. Now, this enslavement became increasingly worse with the arrival of Muslim traders in North Africa, and greatly increased the slave trade. And in fact, we could consider the Trans-Saharan trade as a precursor to the more modern Atlantic slave trade of the 1500s, in which enslaved Africans were brought across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. Now, because of these grueling conditions where people were treated as non-human, many died across or while crossing the Sahara. They were often chained by their necks and lived in really horrible conditions. Now, they were sold for labor, so some did end up working in those salt mines in the Sahara Desert and to Gaza, which we'll talk about soon, in return for horses, because horses were considered especially valuable. Others were sold to other parts of the world as domestic servants or house servants, soldiers, artisans, and artists. Some even rose to be government officials. That takes us to our next topic: Islam spreads to Africa, and conquest and trade. So, conquest and trade is one of the ways in which the religion of Islam spread to this part of the world. Now, we haven't taking a look at Islam in our Africa unit so far, but Islam is a religion that started in Arabia in the 600s. Okay, and if we take a look at our map here, we have the Arabian Peninsula. Okay, we have the cities of Mecca and Medina. And so Mecca and Medina were the starting points of the religion of Islam. And by 642, Arab armies had conquered Egypt. Okay, and we see that here on our map. Okay, this is the land or territory that was added in the 600s. Okay, so that is the first time Islam is brought onto the continent of Africa. Now, when we say Muslim, a Muslim is a follower of the religion of Islam. So Islam is the name of the religion, Muslim is the name of a person who practices that religion. And so these followers of Islam, these Muslims, they would spread their faith throughout North Africa and then eventually West Africa through this Trans-Saharan trade. So, sorry, did that slide. So the first people in Africa to begin to convert to this, new to them religion of Islam were the Berbers. Remember, the Berbers are the native people of North Africa. It wasn't always an easy transition, however. There was a lot of conflict between the Muslims and Berbers during this time. And in fact, in the 1100s, a group of Muslims called the Almoravids ruled and united northwestern Africa. And under their rule, Trans-Saharan trade greatly expanded. And Berber merchants spread goods and their religion across the Sahara. Keep in mind that when people interact with one another, when they're trading goods, they also socialize. And one of the things that they're going to share with one another are their beliefs, their religious beliefs. And that's one of the ways Islam spread, one of the key ways Islam spread across North and West Africa. All right, now the impact of Islam. In the 1000s, West African rulers began to convert. So really royalty and kings, African kings, were the first to convert in West Africa, okay? And many subjects followed their example. If your leader is of a particular religion, then it might be advantageous to you to convert to the same religion as it becomes more commonly accepted. Many West Africans mix their traditional African beliefs. And when we say traditional African beliefs, we're talking, animism, ancestor worship, this idea that nature, the spirit of, nature and our ancestors can bring us good or bad favor depending on how we honor them, was mixed with these beliefs of Islam. And in fact, we can see the breakdown of Islam in this map that I've included on our slide. Notice that, Islam is a predominant religion of not only Arabia, but all of North Africa here. These lines, these borders of modern day countries obviously didn't exist back then. But again, the religious breakdown of North and West Africa really goes back to the Middle Ages. And then notice the further we go south, we still have a high concentration of Muslims here, 30 to 70%. And then this gray area here is actually predominantly Christian. So moving on, the impact that Islam had on North and West Africa. Well, Islamic culture continued to spread. We see the building of mosques. Mosque is a Muslim place of worship. So Christians attend service at church, Jews go to temple or synagogue, and Muslims go to a mosque to pray. And these were built throughout North and West Africa. And Africans really adapted to their environment. When they built mosques, they used what they had. And so mosques in this part of the world we see are made out of materials like mud and even salt blocks to build this architecture. And what we see in the picture down on the right here, that is the mosque in the city of Jenny. Again, the city is pronounced Jenny. The D is silent. And one of the most famous mosques in Africa. Continuing with the impact of Islam, one of the key effects of Islam was the language of Arabic. So along with religious beliefs, Arabs brought the Arabic language. Arabic is the language of Arabia, by the way. And this increased reading and writing, what we call literacy. And so the Quran can only be read. By the way, the Quran is the holy book of Islam, can only be read officially in Arabic. So this, as more people converted to Islam and became Muslims, in order to read their holy book, they needed to learn Arabic. And so mosques really became the universities, the centers for learning. And cities such as Timbuktu and Jenny became famous centers of Muslim art, literature, math, law, and science. All right, just to recap, in this lesson, we learned to analyze the importance of gold, salt, and the enslaved as commodities of trade. And we also learned to explain how Islam spread throughout North and West Africa. Remember, you can always go back at any point during the video and get any parts that you miss, and let me know questions that you may have. In our next lesson, we are going to be taking a look at some of the early civilizations and empires that developed along the Niger River in West Africa. So stay tuned until our next adventure. Mrs. Malcolm, I'm out.